in. Give us just a few moments. While we're letting people in, why don't you let us know where you're joining us from in the chat? Let us know where you're at tonight. Say hi to everyone. Good evening, still letting people in. Hello, Orlando. Maryland.
Oregon.
Yes, Chicago, all over. All right, we're still letting people in. Let us know where you're joining us from. We've got people from all over: Montana, Colorado, Washington, Kentucky,
New Mexico, Seattle,
Missouri, Philly. So nice to have you all here. Still letting people in. We just want to give them a few minutes to join us. New York City with Cecily. We know Cecily. She's part of the Revolution leadership team. We've got Long Island. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. We've got a lot of people joining us. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Sam Fletcher. I'm the Executive Director of the New York State chapter of NASW. Thank you for joining us for this chapter chat. We are thrilled to have Dr. Laura Quiros back with us for the third time to do a chapter chat. If you've seen her before, you know she is a phenomenal presenter. We're always lucky to have her. And I'm going to hand it over to Amelia, and she's going to let you know how you're going to interact with us tonight. And then we'll get us to Laura as quickly as possible.
Awesome. The first thing I'm going to do is ask Sam if she can turn on the closed captioning, because I'm not co-host and I couldn't do that. So while I'm talking about closed captioning, that just turned on, you can see at the bottom of your screen, you can turn that on and off for yourself. So you can choose to show subtitles. If those subtitles are coming up, they're over someone's face, or they're over the presentation, you can click and drag them to anywhere in the screen that you'd like, so they're not in the way. You can also choose to click view full transcript, and the full transcript of this conversation is going to be on the right-hand side of your screen. And you can also choose to hide the subtitles if you want to do so as well. So today we're going to start out with ourselves muted. We'd love to have you engage in the chat box while the presentation is going on. We can also engage with one another through the presentation by using your reactions. So feel free to put a heart or clap or anything that you would like to do. But then, of course, we will open this up. We want to hear from you. We want to have conversation and dialogue. It's really important to hear the voices of social workers across the nation. So feel free to unmute yourself. Just speak into the meeting organically. There's no need to, get in line. Just we want to hear directly from you. So feel free just to unmute yourselves. This is a chapter chat. Chapter chat started initially as a means to socially connect while physically distancing. And now they have just become a way for social workers to connect with each other, share resources, find peer support. And we're really lucky to be having our third presentation with Dr. Laura Quiros. So we've always had a wonderful evening when she has hosted this conversation. Look forward to another one tonight. And so without taking up any more of your valuable time, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Quiros.
Thank you, Amelia, and thank you, Sam. And just a special thank you to everyone out there. I was scanning the audience, and I have students and I have friends and colleagues. And so I'm really excited to hold space with you tonight. And we're going to be talking about accountability and what that looks like. But before I do that, Erica, this is a surprise. So I have another bowl talk tomorrow night. And so since we're here together, and I'm going to have to end 10 minutes before with questions and then sort of move on to my parenting role. Erica, can you just share a little or put in the chat information about our bowl talk tomorrow? Because we have a phenomenal panel and we'd love to see all of you there, given that it's Mental Health Awareness Month as well. So just, a second or two, Erica, thank you for showing up tonight.
No, absolutely. Thanks so much. I love our New York State chapter. We have both Building, Organizing, Leading with Diversity. I'm the chapter board president for New York City and love working with Laura. So tomorrow night, it's Mental Health and Racial Trauma Bowl Talk. So we are gathering together to really have these really needed conversations and difficult conversations. We have over 344 people registered, and it's going to be incredible dialogue. And we invite all of you to attend. I will put the information in the chat. And this is the beginning of many dialogues. So Bold Talks have been, I founded Bold Talks in July, and they take place every other month on the third Wednesday of the month in lieu of board meetings. Instead of meeting, let's just get to the action. So join us tomorrow night, and we will have Dr. Laura back for incredible conversations and much needed dialogue. I'll put it in the chat. Thanks so much, Laura.
Thanks, Erica. So welcome, everyone. It's a beautiful evening. I am saying hello from Montclair, New Jersey, where I live. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm going to do a brief introduction, and then we're going to get right into it. And as Amelia said, we really want to open this up to dialogue, because this talk is on part of the revolution, right? It's a part of stepping into uncomfortable spaces, or what have been perceived as uncomfortable spaces, in order to change organizational culture and shift the dialogue to be more diverse, to be more equitable, and to be more inclusive. And so tonight is about accountability. So my name is Laura Quiros. I am associate professor at Adelphi University, where I've been for the last 11 plus years. I teach social work practice at the doctoral master's, and I teach an undergraduate course named Trauma and the Work of Social Justice. In addition to doing that, I work with organizations from large corporations to small startups I also work in the academic space and in law firms, working around what we are naming diversity, equity, inclusion, social justice. And my work really lives in the sincere integration of how the principal practices of DEI connect to missions, and to connect specifically to organization missions. And so for the social workers here, I really want you to understand that the ways in which you use yourself and your identity as a social worker is incredibly diverse. When I sit with executive teams, when I sit with CEOs, when I sit with boards, the unique thing about me is I'm using my clinical skills to engage and to push conversations in ways that folks who don't have a degree in social work, or who haven't been in the clinical arena, don't have the skills to do that. So when you're thinking about where you want to be in the world, those of you that are already in the field, those of you students in the audience, those of you who are already seasoned clinicians, really think about ways in which you can be creative in terms of how you use yourself to deepen the conversation and to disrupt exclusive spaces that we see all the time. And so I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint, and I'm going to go through this a little bit, but as some of you know who have seen me present before, I'm not going to stay on my PowerPoint. I'm going to keep on moving it up and down during the course of our time together. I also just want to, before we move into the land acknowledgement, I want to name and just acknowledge all of you who have been on the front lines from the beginning of this pandemic. The hard work you have been doing with our clients, and ways in which you have been using yourself, and sometimes even putting yourself at risk to be there. So thank you for that. I also want to just acknowledge that we've all been in over a year of complex trauma, and depending on who we are and what our positionality is, the way in which we have experienced the last year and plus shows up very differently. So the first question I'm sort of posing to you is, how are you using this experience as an opportunity for growth, not only in your personal self, but also in your identity as a social worker, as an administrator? And so, of course, we begin with our land acknowledgement, because without our neighboring Indigenous nations, we wouldn't be here today. And so everything that I do, every time I train, every time I hold space for dialogue, I am incredibly intentional and mindful about how I do that. So I really believe that diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice is an embodiment. It's not something I read, it's not a handout I look over, but it's actually something I strive to live on a daily basis. And so with that, when I hold space, I acknowledge the land before me that is not mine, that was owned and founded by other people who have had histories of trauma. And so let's just take a minute in the beginning of any dialogue that we hold to honor this land acknowledgement. It was interesting because I was just I had to sit through a reaccreditation process because our institution is up in a few years. And I noticed that CSWE introduced the land acknowledgement, which I was very happy about because they hadn't done that before. So again, are you using this in your work? Community agreements. I can't tell you how many times we've had these discussions, and you may have experienced it yourself, when people move from speaking from the I to speaking in third person. And so those of you who have heard me speak before have heard me say this, but I don't think I could say it enough, that we have to only be an expert of our own experience. We can't name other people. We can't be an expert of somebody else's experience. We always have to speak from the I. And in those moments of meetings, in those moments of round tables, in those moments of dialogues, when you see your colleagues or your clients or your leaders switch from an I to a they or to we, are you pausing for a minute and saying, could we come back to speaking from the I? Right? And so those are those moments. And I've done that a few times in meetings this week where I've said, you know what, I hear what you're saying, but could you just speak from the I? Could you just rephrase that and own your words? Next, when do you move in and out? Intentionality and mindfulness. Some of you have been in spaces where you have sat quiet for fears of marginalization, for fears of precarity. Others of you feel more comfortable sort of asserting yourself. In these moments, are you consciously making space for others, and are you being aware of how you move in and how you move out? Those of you who have been doing this work for quite some time. When I say this work, I mean the work of racial equity. I mean the work of social justice. You have to keep on leaning into the journey, that this is a journey, and it's a forever journey. It's a journey that never ends, and it's a journey with no closure. And so how are you creating those moments of discomfort for yourself in order for you to deepen your journey? I noticed for myself with the pandemic that quite recently, maybe in the past few months, I'm a big exercise person. I was a college athlete. It's just something that I do. Some of you may have heard me say this before, but I was noticing that I was taking classes and I was putting myself, maybe unconsciously, in physically uncomfortable situations, not that aren't safe, but I would take, a spin class that was way above my level. I would engage, I'd use a heavier weight. And so I share these examples because I was consciously, or maybe unconsciously, putting myself in physical places of discomfort. And I noticed that the more I did that, when I sat in these very large spaces, or when I showed up for a faculty meeting, I was able to move through my discomfort easier because I was practicing being in places of discomfort. And so we have heard before that the work of diversity, equity, inclusion is uncomfortable, but are you practicing being in uncomfortable places? Literally, right? So you could say, yes, we have to push past the discomfort, but how are you strengthening that muscle to actually do that? What are your ways of doing that? Speaking truth and recognizing and owning where you aren't. The first step in understanding where you are is naming where you are and not pretending that you're somewhere else. This work has to be grounded in compassion and vulnerability, and it also has to be a practice of truth-telling, right? Which is hard to swallow, particularly those of us who have come from families where we weren't taught how to truth tell, where we would tell these small little fibs because we didn't want to make people feel uncomfortable because we didn't want to feel uncomfortable, right? But that's not truth-telling. And so can you think back to sort of familiar patterns or ways in which you were socialized where telling the truth wasn't normative? And so you adopted these ways of being, and as a result, not only were you not living in your power, but you actually were never taught how to speak truth to power, right? For the sake of lack of conflict or whatever it is. And so then you're working with clients or you're working with your colleagues, and are you able to help clients speak the truth if you aren't able to live in those spaces? And so then the final point of this, our community agreements, is the listening piece, which I can't really emphasize enough. I think particularly now, how are we listening? Are we listening to respond? Are we listening and then honoring curiosity and asking questions? Or are we just listening from our own sort of myopic lens and not opening up the space for others? A quick definition in terms of what social justice is, because we've heard a lot of rhetoric, and maybe those of you who are doing the work in the revolution and who are really leaning into this understand what social justice is. But for me, it's always important to unpack rhetoric. And so social justice and social work means an intentional look at how we as a collective participate in systems that have caused harm, while also practicing that critical self-reflection. So it's a two-pronged series, right? It's a looking at the system, and then it's taking those moments of quiet accountability and reflection and understanding who we are in those spaces. It's an explicit connection between the micro, the meso, and the macro. You know, and for my students in the audience, I remind you time and time again that we can't live in those micro spaces. Social work is a person and environment framework. The people are affected by the larger macro environment. And so if our professors, if our teachers, if our supervisors aren't making that micro macro connection for us, are we understanding how research affects practice and how policy affects practice? Or are we just living in those individual deficits of the person that we're working with? For white identified folks out there, seeking out ways of knowing what is implicit and not always consciously related to our identity and our positionality, and seeking out relationships that invite us to have relationships with people of color, with BIPOC individuals. And again, social justice happens in dialogue and with awareness and must include action. I have a colleague of mine, her name is Karen, who I've been working with for quite some time. And she shared these definitions with me in our work together. And so I want to name her because it is through our dialogue that we grew this together. And even though I might be seasoned in this and there's ways in which I work through this, these are not my own. I am on the heels of other people. And so when we are working in those spaces of collaborations, can we also share space, right, in a position of equity and name people who have helped us sort of move this work forward in our own way? So what comes to mind when I think about social justice? These are the adjectives. It's love, it's dialogue, it's critical reflection, it's analysis, it's practice, which is practice and action. It's awareness, awareness of myself, awareness of the other. And it is intentional positive disruption, which we've talked about in another chapter chat. But just to briefly review that, positive disruption, meaning disrupting those spaces that are inherently exclusive. And I think we have an enormous opportunity ahead of us. As we start to get vaccinated as a society, and as we start to re-enter spaces, whether it's the workplace, whether it's the university, whether it's the classroom, to do it differently, right? To disrupt spaces that might not have been inherently inclusive. And by using ourselves to do that in brave and courageous and truth-telling ways. And then the final piece that comes to mind for me is the location of self. Who am I? How do I show up? And that isn't static, that is fluid. The more that I do my own work and my own therapy, the more I'm able to tap into different parts of myself that I might have been ashamed to share before. And then using those points, particularly those points that operate from dominant perspectives, in order to help free up the space for other people. And so my disruption of spaces and my need and responsibility to not stay quiet and to hold folks accountable is not about me, right? It's about my higher order purpose of being able to open up this space for other people. I am just a vehicle in that, right? I am a conduit. And I think social work does a particularly unfortunate job because it talks about this, don't disclose, don't share too much of yourself. Instead of saying, share enough of yourself from the place of mindfulness and intentionality to open up the space for others to share parts of their selves in very deep ways. And so when I talk about inclusion, I talk about the practice of holding each other empathetically accountable. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about empathic accountability. It is the act and embodiment of caring for one another that extends beyond me, it extends beyond the individual into our work, into our spaces, and into our communities. Empathic accountability, right? And so think about that for a moment. And traditionally, when we hear the word accountability, what comes to mind? And that's more a rhetorical question that we're going to get into as soon as I go through 2 more slides. But when you think about accountability, usually accountability has been named as a calling out rather than a calling in. The most important people in my life hold me accountable because they want me to do better, because they care that much about me. They don't hold me accountable because they want to punish me. They don't hold me accountable because they want to shame me. They hold me accountable because they love me enough to say, hey, Laura, you missed that. Or, hey, Laura, your intention was great, but your impact landed wrong. Or, Laura, maybe you should add your pronouns because as a cisgendered person, you have a dominant privilege in that space. So can you be more mindful of that? right? And so these are the ways in which we have to work towards creating cultures in our organizations, in our homes, in our communities, where accountability is not seen as a bad word, where accountability is not seen as a calling out, but it's seen as a calling in. It's a generous act, right? And the irony about this, and I find this irony in social work practice a lot, is that you could probably say that you talk about responsibilities to your clients, right? Show up on time, do the cognitive behavioral homework, make sure you make your appointment, practice meditation, practice grounding. We hold our clients accountable, but then do we allow them to hold us accountable? And even more than that, are we holding the leaders of our organizations accountable to live in the foundational mission of social work, which is social justice, right? And when we're not doing that, why aren't we doing that? And so this is what it means, right? Empathic accountability means accountability that is grounded in empathy. It is grounded in empathy. It is grounded in compassion. The ways in which I define accountability are very much tied to the ways in which I look at my life. And so, I've shared my life story with a lot of you before. And so parts of it is, growing up in a home when there was a lot of trauma and there were no boundaries and no one hold anyone accountable. So when bad things happened, nobody named them, right? And when bad things happen, or when things go unsaid, or when the invisible doesn't become visible, you can go a little, you can have a hard time with that, right? That can bring on a lot of self-doubt, a lot of anxiety, a lot of depression. And so just imagine a world where we were able to lean into this empathic accountability, right? And so we automatically take care of each other by making the invisible visible, and by naming when there has been a microaggression, by naming when there has been a misstep, by naming when there has been an exclusive practice, right? By naming when a person of color or a BIPOC individual gets sidelined or doesn't get credit, right? Or when something hurtful is said in a meeting and people stay silent. So I operate from this perspective purposely, right? And it's very much related to this responsibility that I have to make the world more equitable, more diverse, and more inclusive. And as I shared in my sort of small story of my own home, right? Accountability begins in the home. Think about your own lives and the ways in which you were socialized, and was there accountability, and how was accountability operationalized, right? The ways in which we understand the world, how we learn or do not learn, are grounded a lot in our communities and in our childhood. And so if we have a fear of stepping into those spaces and not holding people accountable, it's because we haven't been given models to do so. And in order to sincerely practice social work, we have to get in touch with our own stuff to be empathic, accountable partners in creating a world where there is inclusion. And so part of my question is, how much time have you spent examining your values and your practices that you grew up with and that you hold? And where does accountability sit with that? And so a question that I want to kind of just start with for all of you, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen, is, what stops us from holding each other accountable? What stops us from holding our colleagues, for holding leaders, for holding our profession accountable? Because this is really the first time in this past year that the profession of social work has been held accountable. And there are some real incredible leaders on this call right now who have made it their life's work to hold social work accountable. And so for those of you in this audience, yes, where are you in this conversation? And what stops you from holding the profession, yourselves, your friends, your family accountable? And yeah, we have fear in there. Somebody had named fear of being shut down, fear of saying the wrong thing. That is real, right? Fear of precarity, fear of losing job, fear. And is that fear anticipatory, right? Is that fear socially constructed in our minds? And if it is, that's worthy. Like, I'm not going to invalidate that. Absolutely, right? But can we sit with that and really interrogate that and think about, well, okay, did something happen at some point where I tried to hold somebody accountable and I got pushed back, I was fired, I was dismissed, and you know, can I step back into that arena, right? Can I step back into that arena as an adult, as a, you know, evolved person, as somebody that has a responsibility to myself and to the field to do a better job at accountability? Because the truth is that if there is, right, this is a transformational moment. And trust me, it's terrifying. I mean, I had a recent faculty meeting where I held the faculty accountable for some of the ways in which we were working towards the mission of social justice. And what happened was the feedback that I was getting, there was a lot of, well, I don't mean to offend you, you know, I'm devil's advocate, you know, I don't want to bring the devil into any work that I do ever, first of all. And second of all, when I'm holding people accountable, it's not about me, right? Like, I'm delivering a message. And so how do we also sort of depersonalize this and get out of us in order for this sort of higher mission of social justice that we're all committed to? And so I'm going to just shut the shade because the light's coming in and I'm having a hard time seeing you. But I'd love for some people, you know, I'd love for like 6 people or so to just share, you know, what you're sitting with, ways in which you have experienced this, anything that you want to bring to this space right now. So you can, I can't see anyone, but Amelia's great at seeing people. And if you want to raise your hand, if you want to unmute, let me know.
I see Veronica with your hand raised.
Yeah, so I think one of the ways that I have found myself to hold myself accountable, or having others, allow others to also give permission to others to hold me accountable, is, for example, in clinical work. I'm learning that it's okay to say what is helpful and what is not. Let me know when it's not also helpful, rather than let me know if I'm not helpful. So allowing to say that there is going to be a when I'm not being helpful. And that does put us in a vulnerability spot, but that is what we're asking from our patients. So it's a way to reflect that to them, that we can hold that vulnerability for them. Because we can't say, oh yeah, I'm holding this anger for you. No, we have to show it. We have to demonstrate that. But I think one of my fears has been that, am I going to be good enough? Am I still going to be good enough? And as we know from the attachment theory, that we only need 30% good enough to be a good enough mother. So, and that's not the role we should primarily take in therapy, but we know that that is a representation sometimes in those rooms. So it brings me back to, I just have to be good enough 30%. And if I could do that, that's my way of being held accountable, that I'm also sharing that power with others to hold me accountable.
Thank you, Veronica, for sharing that. You know, we're so hard on ourselves. And I think that, you know, how do we lean more, particularly in this moment when we are all, you know, just coming out of this, whatever this is, whatever this means for every one of us, which is all very different. How are we doing that? And Veronica, I also just want to underscore what you said about the human aspect of this. We're humans, we're fallible. Like, we're fallible. So can we be fallible? Can we be held accountable? Because when I think about that, it's so much less pressure for me. When I am like, I might make a mistake, I might say something, and that person will hold me accountable, right? These women friends in my life, I know they will tell me, Laura, you know, that didn't land right, or, you know, you need to rest, or whatever it is, and making sure you have those people in your life, because it takes the pressure off on some level, right? Because we're fallible. Erica, did you have a hand raised?
I actually had a moment that one of my clients held me accountable. I ran late, and it was like 15 minutes late. And when I showed up, it's virtual, so it's not like we're in office anymore. So it's not like you're leaving someone waiting in your office. Sometimes things happen. And she was upset, and you know, she said, you know, was really wanted the full session with you because I have a lot to tell you. And she was holding me accountable for being late. And it's, what I learned is really it's good to just be present and just to hold her feelings in without having to apologize or excuse myself, and just honor her for just being able to share what she's feeling with me, and acknowledging that, yeah, it is frustrating for you not to have those extra 15 minutes, and let's work through that together. But how did it feel to share that with me? Like, I was so proud of her for her telling me like what she felt. It was just like a really great moment. Which I could have been very defensive about, because we have so much power in our profession, and it just kind of took me for a turn. So that was like a moment.
I love that, yeah. And it also, I'm guessing it deepens the relationship, right? Because now there's like, oh, you will tell me. And that's great. And we have this connection that we might not have had before. And I think this practice of like not getting defensive. And so, Lindsay, I love your comment in there. And Lindsay says that I've seen a lot of accountability that actually looks and feels like shaming and punishing. And it's hard to find good examples to follow of empathic accountability. I agree with you. And also, when we are held accountable, are we first looking at ourselves and our reaction to where that reaction is, or are we reacting, right? And so something happened to me the other day, and I was on a consulting job that I was doing, and I was told by an organization that, we were sort of wrapping up our services, and I didn't really like how I was spoken to in that moment. And I took out my phone and I went to like furiously text, and then I put it down and I said, don't do that. Like, where is this coming from? It's coming from insecurity. It's coming from what Veronica said. I'm not good enough. It's coming to see that they don't want me anymore. And then I was like, this isn't about you. Like, what do you mean they don't want you anymore? Like, okay, so let's engage in this in sort of an adult, transformational, evolved way. And so I think, does it feel like shaming and punishing, or is that what we're internalizing as shaming or punishing? And so that's my sort of response to Lindsay, is like, yes, accountability can feel like that, but then where is that feeling internal to us? Or is that actually, are we then honoring curiosity and saying, what did you mean by that? Or, I experienced that as a place of shame, right? So I think my point is that in those moments when it feels like shaming or punishing, are we first sitting with ourselves and saying, where is this coming from? And am I internalizing it as shaming and punishing? Or is this really what's happening here? And I think sometimes we don't take that first step to look at our own internal reactions to whatever that moment is. And we just react from a place of fear, insecurity, not good enough, vulnerability, whatever that is. Other people.
I also have something too. My thing is knowing when is the right time or right place to be able to hold people accountable. I don't know if there is such a thing. Sometimes you discuss it like in chambers, but then it needs to be discussed with the whole team, or maybe it was done during a meeting. And kind of going off a little bit of what everybody was saying too, in regards to, you don't want to shame anybody, or like that's all kind of like how you've seen it.
Yeah, that's, tell me your name.
My name is Precious.
Precious, thank you, Precious. So, I wish I could give you a handout that said, when somebody says this, it's the moment to hold them accountable, but I can't. And so we sometimes joke, a colleague of mine jokes saying like, this work is not about a handout, right? And somebody just put something in the chat that might be a good resource as well. And so the 5 Ds of bystander intervention. So I think, again, I can't emphasize this enough, that the piece of this is also about first looking at yourself and where your reaction is. There have been moments also when I have sat in meetings or things have been said and I didn't have the strength, I didn't have the courage, I just didn't have the stamina to step into that space at that moment, and that was okay. And so in those moments, I might follow up with somebody in an email, I might follow up with somebody in a phone call and share what that incident was with that person. So I don't I don't want us to get stuck on when the right place is, because I really believe that if we sit with ourselves in moments of meditation and silence enough, we will be able to understand when those moments are. For me, I feel those moments in my body. So when I am sitting in meetings and something happens, I get a feeling like I start to, this is what happens. I either start to sweat, or I start to shake my leg, or something physical happens to me. And it's those indications that I'm like, okay, I have to disrupt this, or I have to say, Laura, you're consciously not disrupting this, so you have to do it at a different time. And let's figure out why you're not stepping into this space at this moment. And so I don't think as a field, we spend enough time in mindfulness training, right? We have to like my physical reactions is because I know myself well enough, and I rely on my somatic responses to enter conversations, because that's work, that's muscle that I've strengthened. And so I think, again, like, the irony of the field is that we teach our clients these ways of being, but are we actually taking the time to practice them ourselves? Practice them ourselves, not only for ourselves, but then so we can sincerely teach them to our clients, right? And so it's incredibly important. And sometimes you'll enter a conversation and it won't be the quote unquote right time. And there might be a negative disruption, and that's okay too, right? Because at least you shifted the conversation to a place where it moved beyond whatever it was that was happening at that moment. Cicely, you were nodding a lot. I saw you. And so I'd love for you to unmute and share all those nods. I love nods.
Sure. That is what I tend to do in workshops, by the way, is just nod a lot.
I do too.
If I agree. But one thing that was coming up for me is I really like your emphasis on, first we need to check in with ourselves, because I can like totally relate being in meetings, or if something happens, then I feel it physically, right? It's embodied and I feel it physically. So I think that one of the things that I've been thinking about is, when am I in a space to be able to have a conversation, and when am I not in a space? When am I acting from a place? When am I, okay, if I do have this conversation, I'm going to get into my own stuff, and I'm going to get into my own trauma, and I'm going to get into my own insecurities. When am I in that space? And when am I in the space of, you know what, I'm showing up in my strong self, powerful, centered self. And it really takes skill and practice to be able to discern the difference, because there's been moments when I've showed up and had conversations when I was in my head, and it didn't really go that well. And then there's also been moments where I've stepped back and said, you know what, I'm not going to have this conversation now intentionally, but later on I'm going to return to it to make sure that I'm okay. So I think I really just like the distinction, because it really goes back to self-awareness and being aware of how we're showing up, and being aware of when we're starting to get triggered in a particular moment, in a particular interaction, and the choice that we can make in that moment to either call in, not call out, call in or not.
Absolutely. And it's the community you curate too, because I have a friend who's always, I tell this person what happens, and she always says, okay, so what was that about? Okay, so where did that come from? And sometimes I'm like, oh, but then I'm like, but at the end of the day, I'm like, thank goodness, because she gets me to that root of where it is. And so part of this work also is curating your community of people who you can practice this with, right? Who will say to you, okay, I get it, you were tired, but what do you think that's about? Or what are you going to do differently? Or how are you going to do that next time? And so you have to have these co-conspirators, these allies, these people that are on your team in order to help you, and then you help them in return. You can't do this alone. And that's the other thing too, is that, part of, I hope, the work on the revolution and all of what we're doing is also curating community, so that we don't have to do it alone, because we can't do it alone, right? The other thing I want to name is that if your organizations and if your schools of social work have committed to social justice, there's no harm in holding people accountable. And that's what I've leaned on, right? So if an organization is going to call me in and say, Laura, I need you to do this work because we're working towards missions of social justice, it's a free playing field for me, So every time somebody walks out and does not show up in spaces of social justice, I'm like, oh, I thought we were doing social justice. The same thing at the university, right? We want to be a school of social justice. Well, if we want to be a school of social justice, we also have to interrogate academic freedom. We also have to look at the ways we show up in our pedagogy. We also have to look at the ways we work with each other. So on some level, this sort of commitment to social justice allows you to hold people accountable so they can stay with the mission, which is hard when people have never done this work before, right? And when they've done it in performative ways where it hasn't been sort of part of the organizational culture. Any other hands out there? I'd love to know what people are thinking. Even if you don't have a question, make a comment, share your thoughts.
I was just going to say, listening to you talk, I really like the term, the concept of empathetic accountability, because it makes me think about like the drama triangle, right? So what are you intentionally aware of to not put yourself in what role, or bringing someone into that role, whether it's the victim, perpetrator, rescuer. And so in that empathetic accountability space, you remove yourself from kind of going into that drama triangle, right? And you're not rescuing, you're not being the victim, and you're not calling someone out. There's not that shame space. So, and you're not bringing someone else into those roles either. And so
Right.
I really like that concept a lot. Yeah.
Thank you, Amy. I really appreciate that lens on it. Anyone else?
You know, I wanted to add to what was asked before, Justin. When is it right to call someone in or out in a space of in public or in private? I feel like there's been so many times where I have asked myself, like, am I okay not to say this right now? Am I going to be okay when I walk out this room? How am I going to feel with me keeping this to myself? And just really think about how you're going to say it, Erica. And I seriously coach myself before I say it, because I want to be heard and not be felt. And it's so painful to really think about that sometimes, right? Because I don't want to be known as that like feisty Latina in the room, like the only Latina in the room, and then calling people out. And then I become that feisty Latina, but I am a feisty Latina, and I'm proud of it. But I'm a very intelligent feisty Latina, and I'm going to say it in a very intelligent way so you don't remember what I just said. And so it just kind of like perpetuates that whole fear of how am I going to sound? But I love that you mentioned that. How are you going to feel? What is your body saying to you? And also then what are you going to say to yourself, like right before you go to sleep, or when you can't fall asleep because I should have, I would have, I could have said that, and then you don't have that opportunity again. It's just, you think about those things at times.
Totally. And I want to underscore two things you said. And the first one, I'm going to go backwards and then to the front. And that is that for me, staying in that place of silence is more painful than whatever consequences may come from accountability. The second piece of this, Erica, which is so on point, is that accountability lives in the intersections of race and culture and gender and sexuality. So me holding my colleagues, me holding my white colleagues accountable is not the same thing as my white colleagues holding my white colleagues accountable. And I think particularly for BIPOC individuals, as Erica named, and as I too have experienced as an emotional Latina, right, who's, it's all about emotion, that's what it is, right? That there's precarity and real life situations because the ways accountability is not equal, right? Holding people accountable is very much related to your positionality and to your identity. And so my hope and my vision is that we have these universities, classrooms, organizations, clinics, corporations where those stereotypes start to lessen, right? And that anyone can have an equal playing field in accountability, but it isn't equal right now because when the accountability shows up differently, depending on your identity and those social constructions of race and gender that are ingrained in the systems in which we work with. So absolutely. And, just to finish that thought, and then Kate, I see your hand, is that how do we live in our truth, right? So as Erica shared, you know, the spicy Latina, I am emotional. And the truth is that I don't want to not bring emotion into my work. To me, that's dry. To me, that's not who I am. And so let me bring that emotion. And if that emotion makes you uncomfortable, that's about you. It's not about stereotyping me. And so how do we become comfortable with different ways of accountability, different ways of showing up that live our identities and can be inclusive, so that we're not stereotyped or implicit bias doesn't show up because of the way I speak or the way I hold somebody accountable from that space. Kate?
Thank you. I think you answered a lot of it just
Okay.
in that last question and comment, but I guess the piece that I'm still trying to understand and really unpack is like, how do we make a difference between empathic accountability? And I haven't heard that term before with empathy, and tone policing, you know? Because I love what you just said, you know, like we have people from such diverse backgrounds and we want people to bring their energy and their fire, and we need feisty people in this work, you know, and yet the word empathy, you know, kind of has a softness to it. So I'm just wondering if you can kind of explain that or kind of talk to that a little bit more about tone policing and empathy and how those relate.
Sure. So one, yeah, I think that's a great question. So I'm not like, I am not a fan of like rhetoric, right? So like tone policing, cancel culture, like that stuff I need to unpack. Like I don't understand, I intellectually understand it, but like I feel like oftentimes these phrases that are very popular right now or present shuts down dialogue, and you label it what it is instead of actually telling people how it makes you feel. So to answer your question, for me, empathic accountability is about one, how I show up, two, my tone, right? Three, honoring curiosity. So I will ask questions more than I will place blame or shame. Most importantly, it's about my intentionality. So if I am, and we all have those people that trigger us in different ways. And if I am faced with one of those people or I'm faced with one of those situations, I am very conscious about how I respond, because I need to not have my own bias or my own personal experience cloud this moment that could be transformational for other people that isn't about me. So it's exhausting, to be quite honest, to practice accountability through the lens of empathy. But for me, it's about empathy and it's about compassion. It's those same objectives that we saw when I put up that social justice side, because I'm a big believer in revolutionary love. Like I feel like I am calling people in, I am calling people out because of the love of social justice, my love of the profession. And so part of that, it's a full embodiment, right? And so again, like those principles that I just named, specifically intentionality, mindfulness, and I'll notice when I start to get a little triggered, and my indications are I'll start to talk fast, I get sarcastic, and I have to cut it. Like I you know, and that's a clue to me that Laura, fall back. Like that's not cool right now. You can't do that. So again, it's like kind of knowing how you show up and when you're in that space, and honoring curiosity, because the truth is that I want people to do the work themselves. I don't want to tell them what's right and wrong. I want to ask questions so then they do the self-exploration to understand ways that they could do better. Right? I never enter this place from a place of self-righteousness, because who am I to do that, right? This is not a binary right or wrong. This is that complexity, the ambiguity, that space. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you. Thank you.
Great. Nichelle, did you have a question? So nice to see you.
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, I when you were talking about empathetic accountability and how much effort goes into it, I had a moment of like, yes. Recently, I was with a couple of friends who aren't social workers, and they were talking about trauma, and they were like defining trauma. And I was around them, and I was thinking to myself, that's not the definition of it. That's actually not what trauma is. And I'm the only social worker in the room, and I have my own experiences, right? And I do this work, but I also don't want to come off as any type of expert on anything or feel self-righteous. And I know that people can come to their own conclusions about trauma, and it can look different for different people. But I find it hard to be in those spaces because I don't want to be self-righteous, right? And I think I have this kind of like chip on my shoulder being a young social worker where I'm like, I'm not an expert about anything, but I do feel like that definition about trauma is not right. And like, how do you be empathetic and understand that people can view things differently and at the same time say, but I just want to correct you that it's not that actually.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. And I would just suggest honoring curiosity. So in that moment, I might be like, oh, that's interesting. Have you thought about trauma this way, right? Like, so when I think about trauma from a socio-political lens. And so I'm wondering like how you came up with your definition of trauma and if you have room for others, right? So it's strategic, right? I'm asking a question and then I'm moving them to a place of telling me what that's about and offering my own suggestion in a way. So that's interesting. Yeah, I try not to say that's interesting because I actually don't like that phrase, and I wouldn't have said it, but I'll say something like, oh, you know, where did that come from? This is how I think of trauma because X, Y, and Z. So I know we have like a few minutes left, and I just want to make sure there's nothing else in this PowerPoint that is like kind of good stuff for me to share with you before we end tonight. And so, yeah, so I want us to just, this is a perfect way to sort of close things up with this concept of radical self-care, which is incredibly important. When I talk about self-care, I'm not just talking about getting a massage or going to the gym or taking a walk. I'm talking about how you wake up in the morning to how you go to sleep at night. I'm talking about having a pad next to your computer so you can doodle or you can do something while you're in a meeting and you might be triggered, right? I am talking about the ways, the water that you have next to you and the thoughts that go on in your head. I use the word radical because I think we're in a moment, particularly now, when self-care has to be radical, because it can't just be like session 3 in the 15-week syllabus. Like it has to be in everything we do, right? And some moments are filled with more self-care than others, and some days are filled with no self-care, and then you have to double down on your self-care the next day. And so I see accountability as radical self-care because I am taking care of my community by holding my people accountable, by holding organizations accountable. And again, I use the word radical because of the context of the times, and also because the embodiment of caring that extends beyond the individual into the community. This work is not about us. It is about the community. Is it about the society? Is it about our clients, our patients? It's about creating a world where we can see social justice and live social justice, where there is equity, where there is diversity, where there is inclusion. And ultimately, I do believe we will be better. And the more we are able to be human together, the more we're able to disrupt these systems of oppression and practice empathic accountability and acts of self-care as community care. So when I'm taking care of myself, I'm also taking care of my community because I need to show up for my community and just positively disrupt and use myself and hold folks accountable to live this mission of social justice that our profession is grounded in. And so, you know, as we sort of start to wrap up tonight, I want you to really think about a few things. I want you to think about, one, how you engage with accountability, what your history with accountability is. Where does that live? How you were socialized around that, and what your fear, what your precarity, what your hesitation is from stepping into that space. I want you to think about ways in which you can honor curiosity, to use Michelle's example, to ask questions, to share your own self, to move people along, right? I want you to think about social justice as the foundation of this profession, and that this is a journey, and the work that all of you are doing every single day is leading to that there is no end, but we're working to create and change. And I want you to also think about radical self-care and the ways in which you practice that on a daily basis. It's part of your routine, right? And on days where you just can't do it, just say you just can't do it, right? Just don't do it. And if that is a possibility for you, and lean into other stuff, lean into friends, lean into mothering, fathering, partnering, whatever it is that you do that creates your community of cares, and then curate that community for you. So you have those very special people in your life who will tell you what's under that. Tell me more about that. So you can practice sharing yourself and also holding each other accountable. And then lastly, really understanding that accountability is not equal. So the ways in which we show up, our positionality, our identities in all of those different domains affect accountability. And those of us with privileged identities, how are you being allies and co-conspirators in that moment to show up and help your colleagues hold people accountable as well? And so I know I'm sort of at the end of this, but any other thoughts, any other questions, please let me know. And I hope that I will see some of you again tomorrow night for our panel. Anything before we conclude? Are we good? Are you gonna go be accountable? Hold people accountable? We got a lot of work to do. So with that, Sam, Amelia, you wanna wrap us up?
Absolutely.
I just want to thank you before Amelia will wrap us up. I just want to thank you so much. Every time you come, it's just so powerful and it teaches all of us. And we were saying before we started, it fits in with our revolution work perfectly. And I'm going to have Amelia tell everyone how they can join us in more of our race work that we're doing.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Sam. And thank you, Dr. Quiros. This was great. And if anyone, if you came to us from the Revolution or somewhere else, I'm just going to plug a few things for us to connect in the coming weeks. So the Revolution is an initiative, a movement, if you will, of social workers from across the globe, really. We have 10,000 social workers on our contact list, regularly have up to 3,000 to 4,000 folks register, and hundreds, if not thousands, join us every month to talk about naming ways that racism and white supremacy shows up in social work. We've now moved into part of the process in which we've broken out into teams that are doing research and position paper writing to create goals for schools of social work. We've taken those town halls and are now creating white papers and are working towards implementing these changes in systems of power in New York State and beyond. So that next revolution is taking place on May 25th. It's open and free to any social workers anywhere. In these meetings, we prioritize the voices of BIPOC social workers. So white social workers are welcome to come and listen and learn, and BIPOC social workers are there to lead that conversation. The next thing that I want to plug is something that came out of the revolution is a BIPOC only peer support group. So our first peer support and self-care group will be taking place on June 1st. This program is for social workers who experience racism on a regular basis. So if you have questions, if you think that the group's for you, ask yourself that question. Do I experience racism based on the color of my skin on a regular basis? For me, that answer is no, so I do not belong in that group. There will be no staff members, no volunteer members who cannot answer that question that will be present there. This will be BIPOC only. Then the next one after that is actually we have on June 2nd, our very first affinity group for Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. This is also a peer support group that is happening on June 2nd. That is being spearheaded by one of our diversity team members, Carrie Tabag. And we'd love to have any social workers. Again, both of those are also free to any social workers, regardless of membership. We'd love to have you join. These are all initiatives that are entirely powered and led by the communities in which we are seeking to address these injustices. And if you are interested in getting involved, feel free to reach out to us. We love plugging social workers into our work, no matter where they are from around the world. And we love to see the power that are on each of these calls. And we love to support the power that social workers have. So please reach out to us in the future. Please sign up and stay engaged. Thank you so much, Dr. Quiros, for adding another conversation into this thread of revolution that we love to keep going in between all the town halls and peer support groups. So Thank you again. This was recorded. It will be posted to our website as well as our YouTube page. And I hope everyone has a beautiful evening. And I thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, everyone. Be safe. Stay safe.
Have a good one. Bye-bye.